Thank you, Bo. I think we'll just wait another minute or so for people to join on. I see the attendees are increasing, and then we'll begin.
Sounds perfect. We're over 70 already, so that's great. But I know some people will be joining us any moment now. So let's give them a couple more moments, and then we'll get started. And for those of you just joining, we will start momentarily. We have over 80 attendees right now, but there's more going to be joining us soon. So we'll give it just another minute, and then we'll get started.
Okay, so I think we can begin. We've managed to get quite a few people onto the attendee list now. But just before I hand over to Bo, I'll just introduce myself. So I'm Asana, I'm from McGraw Hill, and I've also got my colleagues Peter and Parveen. We'll be here just on the side helping out and responding to you guys in the chat and the Q&A. And just before I do hand over to Bo, I just want to run over a few key little things just before we begin. So just to make sure you guys are comfortable in the webinar itself. So I'm assuming you can all hear me. If you can, please just raise your hand just so I can check all the audio. Perfect. Okay, that's on. If for any reason you can't hear any point, I would just make sure you're connected to the audio, and ideally use a cord into your phone if you do have any internet issues. Otherwise, you should be okay to connect with your computer. Just another tip, if you are streaming anything in the background or anyone in your household is on Netflix during the current time with everybody at home, please just bear in mind if you do have any bandwidth issues, that is probably impacting it as well. And we are recording the session, so we will be sending a recording of this afterwards as well. So if you do miss anything or you need to go recap anything, that will be there. And there will also be Q&A opportunities during the webinar, which Bo will flag up throughout the next hour. And just the final thing, in terms of engagement, you probably noticed you're all muted. That's just to kind of avoid any kind of people talking over one another. But we do have the Q&A function on the right-hand side where you can drop any questions in, and Parveen, Peter, or myself will respond to you, and same in the chat. And then we also have the polling function. So you should be able to see a speaker logo on the right-hand side just above the chat. So if Bo does ask a question where you need to respond kind of a simple yes or no, or any feedback, please do use that as well. And that's all from me. I will hand over to you now, Bo, and make you a presenter.
Thank you very much. And again, welcome to all of you in this webinar. I see we have almost 100 of you in the session, which is just great. And while I get set up here sharing my screen with you for my little presentation, I just wanted to let you know, if at any time during this session you hear a child in the background being murdered, don't worry, it's just my 2-year-old trying to get attention. But usually she's fine. She's fine. Just remember that she's fine. All right. So welcome everyone to this webinar. I'm really looking forward to this. It's nice to have so many of you here. I also have a little the little chat window open. So if you have any questions during the session, feel free to pop it into the chat. If the chat becomes a little bit overwhelming because there are so many of you and there might be a lot of questions, then I will ask my friends from McGraw Hill to moderate that a little bit. So again, welcome, and again, also thank you to our friends at McGraw Hill for hosting this wonderful webinar. So this is on online assessments, some do's and don'ts from my own personal experiences. I will not claim in any way that I am the expert or that anything I say is the truth. So I'm also really curious about the Q&A here later on and your experiences. But let me just briefly introduce myself. And then I will also ask you to participate in a little bit of a Q&A here to find out where you are at in terms of online assessments. So this is, well, this is not a picture of me, obviously, but this is just an introduction slide. I'm Professor of Operations Management at the Nyenrode Business University in the Netherlands. That's the only privately owned university in the Netherlands. We are fairly small, only business school as well as accounting and controlling, nothing else. We have a campus in Brooklyn, which is like the original Brooklyn, and also one in Amsterdam. I teach all the courses that students love to hate, which means anything to do with equations, numbers, spreadsheets, that sort of stuff. So statistics, management science, operations management, those are all kind of my courses. And I've been also a digital faculty consultant for McGraw Hill for the last 5, maybe 6 years. And in that capacity have helped out some colleagues getting them set up for online kinds of things like Connect, etc. I was also the chair of the exam committee in the Netherlands at our university for 4 years. For those of you not familiar with that particular body, the exam committee is basically responsible for all of the grades and all of the academic progress that a student is making. In the end, the chair signs the diplomas as well. So, and with that signature, basically ensures that the academic that the student has earned that diploma, which means that when there's accreditations and such coming by, the exam committee is the one in charge, showing to all of these accreditations that what we have done in terms of testing and in terms of projects and in terms of grades, that all of that is in order. So I was the chair for that for 4 years until about 3 years ago. I'm now the research director, but I still am in close contact with the exam committee, and they ask me for further advice and etc. whenever they're dealing with something like, for example, right now with creating online assessments. I'm also a member of the program committee. That is a committee that consists of a couple of students as well as a couple of faculty members, and we look at the program basically from all angles, trying to ensure that the program is as good as it could possibly be. And of course, also in the program committee, we've been discussing online assessments, and I'll get back to that here in just a moment. Basically, I have been an advocate of moving online with pretty much everything that we do for the last decade or so. That is not to say that I don't want us to teach in class anymore. Actually, at Nyenrode, that's one of our great advantages. I think that we have small class sizes and that we give one-to-one attention, and that I can honestly say I know about half my students' names, sometimes all of them, but most of the time, about half of them. But there is a lot to be said for moving the non-essential parts online. So that means I teach only flipped classrooms. I have my students prepare through videos, etc. And then we spend the class time as efficiently as possible. That also means that I'm an advocate of online testing, not necessarily in the way that things are being set up right now, where students are taking the exams at home. That is not necessarily my preference, although there can be something said for that, because it's, of course, very flexible and easier to organize. In some ways, at least. But at least what I'm trying to get away from is the old school paper-based testing with students writing in their answers. And then actually at our university, we need to make photocopies of every exam before it goes to the grader. And it's a mess. We should get away from that. And also probably good to mention, I teach online courses in the USA right now. Well, right now we're actually in the 1 week between the semester ending and the semester starting. But I also teach online courses there and also have some experiences with online testing over there. So that's basically from my side. So you have a little bit of background information on who I am. And what I would like to do next is have you vote on this question. And the way to do that is on any kind of device, and you can even just open an extra browser if you're watching this webinar in a browser or any kind of online device. You go to shakespeak.me. This is just one of those little polling services. Similar ones are like Poll Everywhere and such, but we just happen to have an account with Shakespeak. So you go to shakespeak.me and you can log in. When you do that, you just get a little login window, and all you do is just put in OA, lowercase OA for online assessment, OA, lowercase, and then this question also shows up on your device. And I'm really curious to hear where you are in terms of online assessments. And so the options I give you here, and they might not be comprehensive, you might not find yourself in one of these 5 categories, but if you're closer to one than another, just vote that. It basically ranges from, well, I've never done any of these and I don't really want to do any of them, or maybe I need to do some, or, well, I need some maybe a little bit later, or maybe you've already conducted several, but you had some problems with them, or maybe actually you're in category E where you say, well, I've done some and they're fine. Particularly, by the way, the voting is totally anonymous. But if you vote for E, of course, then we would love to hear from you as well in the Q&A session. And as you can see on the screen, we have about 30 votes already in, so that's great. I'm a little bit lost now on how many participants we have. Let me see. Oh, we have over 100 participants, so we should be getting a few more votes in here. There we go. We have about 50 of you. Mind you, this is not a right or wrong question. Of course, I use this kind of polling software for questions in my classes on statistics as well, and then there is a right and wrong answer, and then we can decide based on the answers whether we should or should not spend additional time on that particular topic. But this is not a right or wrong question, so vote whatever your heart desires. And at 111 participants, if we get to around 80 votes, I think that's fairly representative for the whole body. So let's just get a couple more votes in here. And then I'm curious to see where you guys are with online assessments. All right, so we got a little over 80, so that's great. Let's go ahead and see what you have voted. If this moves on to the next slide, that would be stellar. There we go. Okay, so that's a nice and relatively even spread. There's only a very few of you, actually that's just one vote, I guess, with 1.2%, that you've never done any and will not do any in the near future. I guess that makes sense, because if you are in that category, then you are in this webinar just for general interest. Everyone else has done some testing to some degree, and we kind of see here at the end, we see the people. So we have about, what is that, 40% who have never done any, and about 60% who have done online assessments. And within both of those categories, there's again relatively even spread, although this is kind of like 2 to 1. I need to do some in the near future or maybe sometime later. So about 40% of you will have to do online assessments for the first time. So that's interesting. And the other one, and this is really interesting to me, about a third of you say that you have conducted several online tests without any real problems. So as I go over my kind of do's and don'ts, please do chime in later as well in the Q&A about things that you would like to add, because again, I am not the expert and I don't have the final word on this. And of course, from the people like about a quarter of you who have done some but had some problems with this, that we also would like to hear from you, of course. That could help all of us do better in the future. And I see the votes keep updating. But at this point, I think I'm just going to go ahead and move on a little bit. So what I find personally is that online teaching is fairly easy. Some of my colleagues might disagree because they don't like technology and they think, oh, Teams meetings or Zoom or anything like that, I don't like it. I just want to stand in front of a real classroom. And while fundamentally I agree, because I like to work with students, I like to help them out on the spot. For me personally, the move to teaching online and to teaching through Teams and Zoom and such like this, things like that was fairly easy to do. Online assessments, I don't think is that easy. Of course, you can think the easiest solution is just have your test online with maybe some kind of proctoring, because of course we want to know that the student is actually doing the exam and is not cheating, etc. But this won't always work. We will talk about that on the next slide, how you can do that. But it won't always work. Just to give you a very simple example, what if students have to draw something? Well, tough luck, because you usually on normal kind of testing software, you can't just make easy drawings. Now, there might be some add-ons or some specialized testing software in which that's possible, but those kinds of questions are a lot harder to do. What if they have to write equations? In general, students can type as fast as they can write, and it's much more easy to read, but typing equations in an equation editor on an exam, that's extremely cumbersome. So there's a couple of things that you just can't do as easily online, and I think it's a little bit too easy to just say, you know what, I just have a paper-based exam, I just transfer it to an online system, and boom, everything will work. I'm not so sure that's the case. So here are some viable alternatives that we have come up with at our university to give as options to the faculty as they're moving from paper-based testing to online testing. And the first one, it just starts with, you know what, if you have, let's say, a midterm and then later on a final on the same learning objectives, then you know what, just cancel the midterm, because it's just too much of a bother. You can just make the midterm like a formative test rather than a summative one, so students can still learn from it, but you just don't make it a summative test. So that's of course an easy solution. But if you only have a final and that is it, then you have to come up with other solutions. You can maybe switch to an oral test where you do like a meeting, not webinar style like this, but you just do a one-to-one meeting. Of course, that's only viable with a limited number of students. I'm going to do that with one of my tests. It's actually a resit exam, and I only have 9 students. And it's an exam where they have to do actually some Excel exercises. Now, again, that's something that you cannot do in a standard testing software, but one-to-one, I can have them share their screen. They can show me what they can do in Excel, and I can pretty much I can get a sense of what their capabilities are from that. Of course, you can also switch to essays and papers. Some of us are doing that already, right? You give them a take-home paper exam. That again is usually only viable for a limited number of students. Also the higher Bloom levels, because you can't ask multiple choice questions on a take-home paper exam, of course. Definitely some things to consider is that you switch to open book testing. When you do an online exam, it's really hard to control for the fact that they might be looking at other sources. So I would definitely switch to open book testing, which, by the way, I've been advocating for years anyway, regardless of online testing, because I think it's much more about the skills that students have than the stuff that they remember. Of course, there might be some topics where some of us would say, you know what, these are just things that they absolutely have to know and that they shouldn't be able to look it up. But for me, like, for example, a statistics class, do I care if they can remember the t-test for comparing two averages? Of course not. I don't care. And then, of course, we have someone on the chat saying, well, they share screens on WhatsApp. We'll get to that here in just a moment. That's one of the ways in which students, of course, can cheat. Thank you, Elizabeth, for that comment there. You can also switch to take-home exams entirely. Just give them an exam and say, you know, just send me back your answers in 2 or 3 days. Very, very loose control on that, of course, because how do you know that the student actually took it him or herself? And if you want to consider maybe the lower levels of Bloom, then consider using some algorithmic questions. For numerical questions, of course, this is fairly easy to do, where you just create maybe 50 or even 100 different versions of the same question. For more theoretical-based questions, that's a little bit harder to do. And also, if you have a larger test bank, and I'll get back to that here in just a moment as well, then you can randomly select items from a larger test bank as well. But if you don't have that yet, setting up such a thing is also a huge bother. So probably not for something that you can easily implement in the near future. So then talking about, I think, what will be the most often used approach, which is that you do an online exam where you have some kind of proctoring service. And the picture I'm showing here on the right-hand side is a typical output of a program called Proctorio. There's a couple different of these programs, and basically they just kind of flag all kinds of things like abnormalities. They flag when a student moves away. They flag when a student looks away too often. They flag all kinds of things through some AI. This kind of output is now being generated a lot by these kinds of programs, just because the traditional service where there's actually a person watching the screen and the webcam is completely overloaded at the moment. So going to my online class that I teach in the United States, we used to use a system called ProctorU, where students could actually make a choice. They can either go to a testing center to take the exam, or they can do it at home, kind of like they're doing now, but then there would be a person watching, I don't know from where, could be India, could be China, could be Scotland, could be anywhere, watching their screen and their webcam and making sure that the student isn't cheating. Now, of course, that person is probably watching maybe 5 or even 10 students at the same time, but there's definitely a limit to how many people, how many students one of these employees can keep an eye on closely. So basically demand for this is completely overloaded. And then Elizabeth again is chiming in on the chat. She says you're assuming the students will use a camera. Some students don't do it, and that's definitely a problem that we ran into as well in Utah. So again, Elizabeth, you're one step ahead of me. Great. So what we tried to do is we tried to install ProctorU for this online proctoring in the United States. And it basically ended up falling apart because there were students who said they didn't have a camera installed or they don't have a webcam, they don't want to buy a webcam. The system was not really user-friendly. There was no support. My colleague there had to just figure all of this out by himself. It just turned into a giant nightmare. The technology didn't work. So in the end, we just said, you know what? We already have a giant test bank that we developed over the last couple of years. Lucky us, I guess. And so we're randomly pulling from that, and we're just going to, we're basically going to hope that you're not going to cheat and basically do your own exam rather than do someone else's. Let's see, Afsana says also we use Wiseflow. Yeah, and then you have some kind of lockdown browser as well. So anyway, these kinds of programs, Proctorio, ProctorU, and others, they do a reasonable job through their AI. And then, of course, you still have to have real-life proctors to go through and check all the flags. It's kind of similar to like a plagiarism software, because if you think about plagiarism, software doesn't detect plagiarism. It just detects text that is the same. Just like one of these systems, they're not detecting fraud. They're just detecting behavior that might be considered fraud, and you still have to have real-life proctors look at this. So we have trained our proctors who used to walk around in our exam hall to now look at these screens and see, well, is there something going on here? And if they believe that there's something going on, then it gets moved again to the exam committee. So that's what these systems will do, but there is a lot of concern over these kinds of systems. I don't know if you've been reading the news lately, particularly in the Netherlands, which is where I'm located. Students are really concerned about privacy. Just to give you an idea of how this works, when the student logs on, they first have to do a room scan. So they have to pick up their computer and move it around so you can see the whole room. Then they're concerned, of course, about where the data is stored, for how long, who has access to this data, for how long, what is going to be done with this, because, of course, they're basically being recorded in their private homes, and that data is stored somewhere. Now, I'm not sure about all the other services, but I do know about Proctorio. They promise, and I'm not an IT guy, so I'm not sure to what extent I can trust that, but I decide to just trust it, and that other people have looked into it, and if they're lying, then they will have big problems. But basically, they're promising that the data is stored on secure servers for 1 month only, and that Proctorio cannot even access it themselves, and that only authorized people from the university can look at it, such as, for example, our proctors. That is major concern for students. And so if they don't want to take it, in this way, they actually are allowed to raise these concerns, and then they will have to do the exam with the next cohort, assuming that the next cohort is back to normal and we can do normal exams again. So that's definitely a concern. There's other concerns as well. As mentioned already by Elizabeth, for example, well, what if they don't have a webcam? Well, what if they don't have a quiet place where they can do the exam? What if they don't have secure internet and solid internet that works? How about, this is an interesting one that came up, how about toilet breaks? Originally, we had said, nah, we're not going to do toilet breaks because then you're going to be away and we don't know what you're doing. Well, you have to realize that we do 3-hour exams. And some of our students just literally said, well, then I can't do it. I simply cannot do a 3-hour exam without toilet breaks. What do you want me to do? Just wet myself? So we said, okay, you know what? Not in the first half hour, not in the last half hour, but in the middle part, if you have to go to the toilet, you can go once and you can go a maximum of 5 minutes. Of course, it's flagged by Proctorio, like, hey, the person is gone. But if that's the only time, then that's okay. Again, though, this means that you definitely have to offer an open book exam, because if this is a closed book, then obviously what are students going to do? They're going to wait until about 40 minutes before the end. Then they're going to go to the toilet, and I'm going to use quotation marks here. They're going to go to the toilet and look up the answers that they couldn't remember. So definitely that only works for an open book exam. All right, so that's just some information on how you can do your exams online in different kinds of styles, and what you can think about when you're doing it with online proctors. So as my final slide, before I have my final question for you and we open it up to the Q&A, I just have some do's and don'ts. Again, these are just my thoughts on what I've noticed as well as at our university in the Netherlands, as well as in the United States for my classes there. So these are my do's, the things that you should do if you are considering doing online assessments. If you are making a move to online assessments right now because of the Corona circumstances, then I would definitely recommend that you treat your students as stakeholders. There might be some different countries where this is perhaps not as important, because students will just do whatever you tell them to do. That's not the case in the Netherlands, and I know some other countries in Europe as well. You tell students, oh, by the way, we're going to do things differently, and you have to record your room, and the data will be stored somewhere, but we don't know where. They're going to just basically rebel and say, well, heck no, we're not going to do that. So we have really tried to treat our students as stakeholders in this process. We involve them in all the decision making. We have had meetings with both the program committee as well as the student representative board. For my own exams and resit exams, I talk to the students and say, well, here are some options on how we can do it. What are your preferences? Of course, in the end, the learning objectives have to be measured, but involving the students in that process, that definitely improves the chances of it being successful. Then my second bullet point here is it's very important that you design a process that works for you, and you test it. You test it, and then when you know it works, then you clearly communicate it to everyone. This was the problem that we had in the US, and my colleague and I, he had to just basically figure out everything on his own. There was no system in place, there was no support in place, and we were just hoping that things would go well. Well, sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. The system just kept kicking students out, and we didn't know why. And for some students, the system didn't even basically initialize, and so all kinds of problems. So design the process, and then really test it, and then communicate it. Of course, perhaps even easier than designing a whole process in the system is that considering the alternative forms of assessment, as we discussed earlier. And to come up to address the whole cheating issue, and I have some other comments in the don'ts category here in a moment, there's a couple of things that you could also consider. If you have a 3-hour exam, why not split it up into 2 1.5-hour or even 3 1-hour exams? This comes with some benefits, because you can cover specific topics in each exam. You can do them back to back, or you can even do them with time in between, or even days in between. One of the advantages of having moved online, I'm not sure if you have also experienced this, is that it's actually a little bit easier and a little bit more flexible to schedule things, because people don't have to travel and they don't have to worry about being in 2 places back to back, because they can all do it from home. So splitting up a larger, longer exam into smaller, shorter exams might be one way to avoid the cheating. I see also a question coming in from one of our participants is, why do you have to scan the room? I think that refers to the Proctorio issue. That's just a thing that Proctorio asks you to do, and it's basically to ensure that there's no other people in the room, and that there's no other computer in the room or something like that, where, because when you take the exam on your computer, it does the whole lockdown browser thing. But if you have another computer sitting right next to that one, that of course doesn't really help. And if there's another person just kind of sitting in the room, that doesn't help either. And then if there's changes in the room later, then again, it can flag that. So that's just one thing that they have built in to avoid cheating a little bit. Another thing that you can do is, when you do have a kind of a longer exam where you have multiple questions, is you can randomize the order of the questions and show one at a time, also in a random order. So this kind of goes back to the comment that was made earlier by Elizabeth about, well, they share screens on WhatsApp. Yeah, they could, but if you have, let's say, maybe 20 or 30 questions and they're trying to share screens, but I'm on question 1, you're on question 1, and my question 1 might be question 17 out of 30, and yours might be question 12 out of 30. By the time we get to the same question, and I cannot go back to earlier questions, that is a little bit harder to do. And all the software related to testing has this option where you can show questions one at a time in a random order, and of course for multiple choice also randomize the order of the answers as well. And finally, if you do have the larger banks, then try to randomly select items from a larger bank. This is a lot of work. I know from first-hand experience because I set that up after we had about 600-700 students taking our exams. I created all kinds of groups for questions on the same topic and the same difficulty level based on previous results, put them in little groups of 2 or 3, maybe sometimes 5 questions, and then picking 1 or 2 questions out of each category. Setting it up took me about 2 days, but now I never have to make a new exam because I have over 1 trillion different exams. And they're all equally difficult because they are pulling questions from the same kind of groups. So that's something that you can do if you have a larger bank. And of course, McGraw Hill's Connect has that built in already. They have a lot of test bank questions built in already. So that's something that you can pull from. But you kind of have to know a little bit about how students are going to do on those questions. Because otherwise you might get complaints from students about, oh, well, but I got much harder questions than my friend did. So that's something that, these are some things that you can do to limit cheating. So then finally, before, again, I have one more little question for you, and we open it up for more Q&A, is here's some of my don'ts. First of all, and my colleague in the US can definitely attest to this, don't underestimate the move to online assessments. It's not as easy as saying, oh, I have a paper-based exam, I just copy over the questions into some kind of online testing software, and everything is, easy from here on out. Definitely not the case. Second bullet point, again, depending a little bit on the region and depending a little bit on how students behave at your university, I would recommend against just forcing them to take exams with online proctoring, because as we noticed, at least in the Netherlands, is that won't fly. I also would recommend that you don't treat an online assessment as a normal exam that just happens to be online. So again, going back to, you can't just copy paste your paper-based exam into an online environment. All right, then we get to the cheating part. So I'm pretty naive. I'm pretty trusting. Then I became chair of the exam committee, and I had to deal with students who were cheaters. And when you deal with the first student, you're thinking, oh, wow, this is an anomaly. There's just one student who did something that he wasn't supposed to do. After you've dealt with dozens of students, you don't think it's an anomaly anymore. It is always a minority. That is the good news, but it is not zero. And so for me personally, and I'm not sure if any of you have heard of this website called chegg.com. This is a website that offers students online tutoring, and it's to help them with their homework. Well, that's wonderful, but students can also use it during an exam. And literally, that's what happened to one of my online exams when I wasn't using a lockdown browser. And basically what Chegg then does is students can post their questions, and usually an hour and a half to 2 hours later, the answer is posted by some kind of tutor. And that's, you can call it ghostwriting, you can call it whatever you like. Luckily for me, during that particular exam, there was maybe about 6 or 7 questions that the online tutors had provided help on. On all but 1 or maybe 2, their answers were incorrect. So that was awesome because the students who actually used it failed because they used it. So that was great for me, but that was, I guess, just lucky. But basically, that's my don't. Don't think that your students won't cheat, because they will. And it is a little bit more, let's say, alluring, a little bit more enticing to cheat when you're already online on your computer. So that's why you do have to come up with certain ways of, well, at least not making it too easy for them to cheat. One thing that we also do at our university is before an online exam, we have our students sign an online pledge that they will not be cheating. Of course, signing that pledge doesn't mean that they will not cheat, but research has shown, as we know from our ethics colleagues, research has shown that even if it doesn't limit the amount of cheating that a student will do him or herself, by signing such a pledge, at least they won't involve other students in it. So that's something that we hope is true. It's hard to know. And finally, this is just a little quirky point that we found out about 2 weeks ago when we did our first exam with this Proctorio service for 77 accountancy students, and they were taking a statistics exam, one of my exams. 3 out of those 77 happened to be on the same IP address. Well, that could be because they might be in some kind of student housing, and so 3 of them could be on the same IP address. But after about half an hour, the 3 of them collectively jumped to Madrid. And at that point, Proctorio said, that can't be, so they kicked them out. We managed to get them back in manually, but then another half hour later, they collectively jumped to LA, to Los Angeles in California. And then again, Proctorio said, nah, we're not having this. So they kicked him out again. And basically at that point, during the exam, we were like, well, we don't know what's going on, but you'll just have to do another exam. But basically, of course, it turned out that they were using VPN. And if you don't know what that is, it basically, it masks where you are and it can kind of jump you all around the world. And that's something that these online proctoring services just don't know how to deal with. So if you do one of these online exams, then please make sure to include in your instructions to the students that the students cannot use a VPN, because that will mess things up royally. Okay, so here, that was basically the end of what I wanted to share with you, but I do have one little question for you. Let's say that you were considering online assessments in the near future, and I think basically all of you were or already had done some in the past. What is your stance on this now? Maybe now, after I've given you some of this, my own experiences, maybe you no longer want to do online assessments because it's too much hassle. Or maybe you say, well, I still need to, but I'm not looking forward to it. Or maybe you say you're a little bit more confident because you know a little bit more about what could happen and how to avoid that. Or maybe you say, no, I'm quite sure it will work out just fine. And maybe even you say, well, I wasn't really considering it before, or I was really against it, but now I'm actually considering it. Now I'm maybe even looking forward to it. Given that we had about 30% of you already saying, we had no problems, I'm expecting around 30 or 40% to go for answer D, but we'll find out here in just a moment. Again, let's try to go to about 80 votes. We're about halfway there already. That's great. So let's see if we can get about 80 votes out of the participants, who have grown to 120. Very good. And there we are at 50. And again, these answers are not comprehensive. Maybe your answer is not exactly there, but then just vote for the one that's nearest to your opinion. It was a little bit difficult to have all possibilities on this one slide. And at the moment, if you're thinking about a particular question, then I think you can ask it as well. Afsana, I think you have kind of taken over the moderating role for this, but if you guys have any questions or comments or feedback, that would be great. And we're nearing on 70, so let's go a little bit more. And if we get no more votes in the next couple of seconds, then we'll just continue and see what you guys think. But I know if there's 120 of you, we can get more than 66 votes. Come on. Here, Peter has a very good question about online pedagogy, and not just assignments, but the whole package of teaching, learning, and assessment. That is an excellent question that my colleague Caroline will cover tomorrow in her webinar. I won't call myself a pedagogicalist. No, that's not the right word. I'm not a pedagogue. That's not the right word either. Anyway, go ahead and join the webinar tomorrow by Caroline, who has a great bunch of slides on that. Thank you for your question, Peter. And Elizabeth said, yeah, the solution is to have a giant test bank. That is definitely one of the good solutions. I see we're at 72 and we're not really growing. So let's see what you guys think. Are we moving on to the next slide here? Come on, you can do it. There we go. All right, so there's still the one person who says, I don't want to do this. That's fine. There's about a third of you who are really not looking forward to it. There's also a third that are a little bit more confident now. And again, we have around that, well, 26, it was 30% earlier, who was quite sure it works out just fine. So I think this is fairly similar to what we started with, maybe a slight little shift towards a little bit more confidence to how this will all work out. So that would be, I see that as a bonus or a good takeaway from this. And Liana says, in South Africa, we have low bandwidth. Yeah, video proctoring will not work. Yeah, no, I agree that is a problem as well. So in those kinds of cases, I would definitely consider alternative assessments, or if you cannot really do online proctoring, but you do have to use some kind of exam that they take, then again, go back to the solution of having a big test bank, as Elizabeth also pointed out. That's something that has worked for us quite well, but that does take a lot of time setting up. It would take, yeah, like I said, about two days to basically set up and have everything organized. Here we go. We have more comments coming in. What do you think about marking process and rubrics? Are you in favor? Should we give elaborate feedback if it was an assignment? Because in the exams, we give brief comments and no rubrics are used. Actually, I'm a huge proponent of rubrics. In Canvas, I use them all the time. In Cirrus, which is our testing software, there's not such a thing as a rubric, but there is an answer model. When I do my exams, I have, just to give you an idea, I have a statistics exam for about 150 students. Half of the exam is multiple choice, and in the answer model, I already explained which is the right answer and why, so that I don't have to do anything on that. And the other half are short essay questions, and I always give them feedback. The answer model that I create beforehand already has the 3 or 4 most typical mistakes that I can think of. And if they make those mistakes, I don't give any additional feedback because in my answer model, I already say how many points you get if you make mistake A, B, C, or D. But if they make a different mistake, and students are very creative in making mistakes, then I do write a little bit of feedback. So I would definitely go with not perhaps elaborate feedback, but give them feedback, because an exam is really a learning experience for the students. Vincent says, for algorithmic numerical questions, you can change the text as well as the numbers, change the order of paragraphs and sentences. That really depends on the software you're using. In Canvas, that I know you can make algorithmic questions in, that is usually just for the numbers, although you can also have, let's say, a multiple drop-down question where you have a sentence and you have some words blotted out, and for each of those blots, students can choose between 3 or 4 different options. So that's also something that you can do. Marking rubrics work well. Yeah, you mentioned using Connect test bank. Is this something which you can use for assessments? Yeah, so the Connect test banks, that's a McGraw Hill product. So I would say talk to your McGraw Hill representative. But basically, it's this kind of similar, like in the old days when you adopted a book by any kind of publisher, you also get like a test bank of questions, right? And you can pull from those and put them in a paper-based exam. Well, they've done a great job for you already about, related to these test banks. So depending on the topic that you have, the book that you adopt, or rather the online platform that you adopt that happens to come with a book, is how I see it now. There is a test bank usually included with many, many questions. So definitely talk to your Connect rep for that. Let me see, easier for some courses, but for exams like accounting, not always easy to make. Yeah, no, I realize that some courses it's easier to do algorithmic questions than for others, although for accounting, I can also imagine that to be relatively straightforward, at least the numerical questions you can do. Can one use this method of assessment for engineering subjects, which requires drawings and equations? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about drawings and equations. Equations, even in statistics, which is very equations-based, I tell my students not to bother with equations. Related to the drawings, one thing that we have done for an economics exam, which is taking place this Friday, usually they have to draw some kind of demand curve kind of thing with some information from a story. What we have actually done is we've hired a graphics designer, and he came up for the 4 or 5 questions that deal with this. He came up with 5 or 6 alternative drawings, and they were very, professionally developed. And of course, with the help of the professor who knows what these graphs should look like or could look like. And basically now it becomes not so much a multiple choice question, but first of all, pick the drawing that belongs to this story, and then also explain why that is the case. And also on the chart, there might be 1 or 2 numbers that are hidden, and please explain what those numbers should be. So basically, you come up with a workaround for these drawings. So that's one thing that we have done as well. What about testing to learn about student engagement with material as opposed to pure testing of knowledge? That's definitely something I do throughout my my courses during the sessions with these kind of Shakespeare kind of questions that we did with you as well. And also, if I use my Connect, I use it only for formative. I don't use it for summative. And the formative stuff that they do in there, some homework assignments, etc. Connect then comes up with what's called the online engagement indicator. Even has the word engagement in it, so it must be what your question is about, Danny. And basically, that online engagement indicator has a very, very strong relationship with the grade. And a white paper that I co-wrote with McGraw Hill just came out about that topic. So if you want to know more about that, reach out again to your McGraw Hill representative. That's a nice little white paper in which I looked at the online engagement indicator's relationship with the final exam score in my courses. And very strong relationship. Whereas things like maybe gender or age or ethnicity, no impact on the grade. The only thing that had a significant impact was the online engagement indicator. All right, this is from Velapi, can one use this method of assessment for engineering subjects? Oh, the drawings and equations. So we talked about that, okay. Question banks are great, but always check for accuracy. There's occasional mistakes in them. Yes, Frank, I totally agree with that. Even in McGraw Hill's content, I don't work for them. I just represent them here and there, but I don't work for them. There are some issues, and definitely do check the accuracy, particularly if you have kind of like an algorithmic question where there's multiple options. Sometimes the answer has some kind of equation in it to determine what the right answer should be, and there might be a little mistake in there. By and large, what I have found from Connect is maybe one question in I don't know, maybe one question in 100 that has some issues, but yeah, that would be a problem. Of course, if you do that for a summative test, particularly during these strange times and circumstances, I would just basically say, you know what, if there's a mistake in the question, you get full credit for the question, regardless of what your answer was. I think we also need to be a little bit lenient towards our students in these crazy times. As things, settle down and things get back to normal, of course, we can get a little bit more strict again, but if there's a problem in a question, then definitely just give them full credit. Please repeat the comment on how to assess accounting. Leonie asked that question. I'm not entirely sure that I've had any comment on how to assess accounting, but if you have an accounting course or a engineering course or any kind of course that has some numerical analyses in it, then you can definitely go with some algorithmic questions. I'm using that for my statistics as well. Ahmed, you're welcome that you joined late, don't worry. There is definitely a recording of this presentation that will go out to all of you. So that shouldn't be a problem. All right, that was a lot of questions that I tried to give feedback on really quickly. So I think it's a good thing that the whole thing is recorded. Alsana, at this point, should I just kind of stop sharing my screen and hand it back to you, or what do you want to do?
I think we have a few minutes. If you're happy to continue answering questions, it's completely up to you.
No problem.
We've got some time. We've got about 10 minutes left.
Okay, yeah, if there's more questions, and also not just questions, but if you have your own experiences, like I said earlier in the Shakespeare questions, we saw that about 30% of you have had some good success with doing online testing. If you have any experiences that are different or they add to what I said, please do share it, because again, I'm not an expert on this. I just have some experience with this, and I would love to hear from you as well. What you do to make sure that students can take an exam in a good way, that they don't cheat, at least we don't think so, and that the learning objectives are covered. But again, if you have any other questions, then please feel free to ask. And there's 100 of you left. There must be some questions or comments. So here we got one from Lindsay. Do you think the shift to online learning assessment will accelerate the introduction of best pedagogical practice? Reduced use of traditional time-critical fact testing exams. Well, okay, so maybe not directly related to that comment. I absolutely see a giant leap that we're making, at least at our university, but also other universities, towards more online engagement. It's, again, something I've been advocating for at least 5 years, probably even 10. We had colleagues that were still using overhead projectors, that were using VHS recorders, that were just, using chalk on a board, and it's just, that's not the way that students learn anymore these days. So the pedagogical practices for teaching online, Caroline is going to cover that in more detail tomorrow in her webinar. But definitely, I see a lot of activity, and in the first couple of weeks of the lockdown, at least here in the Netherlands, I noticed that my direct colleagues, were making progress leaps and bounds compared to even like 5 years before. So in 2 weeks, I saw more movement and more innovation and more trial and error than ever before. And that's kind of a nice thing about this crisis now too, is students are also more forgiving. what we find, at least at our university, is by and large that students don't want to see their studies delayed. And so if you, like, for example, I did my very first Teams class, maybe, 5 weeks ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, and some things didn't work because, just to give a silly example, there's a little polling tool in there. Well, the polling tool didn't work. And so I was fidgeting with that for about 2 minutes, and then I just gave up and I went back to my Shakespeare through my slides. Students are forgiving of that right now. Now, 5 years from now, no, then you got to know what you're doing. But right now, just trial and error, at least with the online teaching, until you develop something that works for you. With the assessment, there's a little bit less wiggle room for trial and error, of course. But definitely for the teaching, go for it. Just try it out. And then Vincent has a nice question too. Is the measure of success that you get a normal distribution of the marks? And Lindsay says, thanks, I agree. So that great. We agree, Lindsay. Good. So yeah, Vincent, that's a good question. What is the measure of success for a test? Depending on the group size, a normal distribution is always nice. We actually have some standard grading procedure rules as well, in the sense that the average of the exam should be between a 60 and an 80%. That, of course, is very country dependent. For example, in Germany, a 1 is the best and a 10 is the lowest. In other countries, if you don't get at least a 90%, then you basically failed. In the Netherlands, the threshold for passing a course is a 55%, and an 80% basically means that you're cum laude material. So that's why we say the average of an exam should be between 60 and 80%, and the pass rate of the exam should be between 50 and 90%. So those are just some very, very wide guidelines. We don't do curving so much in the Netherlands. We do it maybe implicitly. So, for example, if I grade an exam and the average is like a 5.4 or a 54%, then I will try to increase it a little bit, because that is really low. So I should increase it. And on the other side, if I do an assignment and I get like an 85% on average, I know that I need to make it a little bit more difficult next year. But in general, yeah, if you get a normal distribution of the marks and your average is not strange and your pass rate is not strange, then you've done a good online test. Perhaps also take into account whether students complained, like the qualitative feedback you got. And here one from Hannah Mosley. Have you had any students asking for extra time during an online assessment to allow for slow typing? Wow, Hannah, that's a great question. Actually, no, we haven't had that. What we have in our system, in our university, is in general, students are eligible for additional time on an exam if they have dyslexia, dyscalculia, ADHD, or ADD. That's the list right now. And I actually, when I was the chair of the exam committee, it was just dyslexia, because I don't really believe in any of the other things that they should get extra time for that. But okay, we've softened up on that a little bit. And basically what it is they get 10 minutes per hour. So if the exam is, let's say, 2 hours, they get 20 extra minutes. This is actually one of the many things that's easier to monitor in an online exam than in a physical exam, because basically what you do, you just put in the system, this student gets 20 extra minutes, and then the timer just gets 20 extra minutes. And when the time's done, it's done. And one of the things that we always experience when we do a physical test is, it's time. Well, there's 120 students sitting there. They cannot end everyone exactly at the same time if you have maybe 3 or 4 proctors walking around taking their exams from them. So inevitably, some students have more time than others because they just happen to sit in a spot where they can continue working for 3 or 4 minutes before the proctor gets to them. So actually, this is one of the many things that's easier in online testing. But we've never had the comment that I can't type very fast, so therefore I need extra time. But maybe we'll get that comment soon. And Heather says, how much time should one allow per multiple choice question in a test? Oh, that totally depends on the difficulty of the multiple choice question, right? On average, maybe like 3 or 4 minutes. But if you have a really tough question, multiple choice question could take up to an hour, or it could just be, just reading a 1-line question with 4 answers, 3 of which are stupid, and it takes like 10 seconds. So I don't think there's one answer to that, Heather. That really depends on your topic. I will say though, if you're designing that for the first time, just rather put too many questions in there than not enough. The nice thing about having too many, and if you just notice that on average, a lot of students don't finish the exam, you can always increase the grades. That's not so hard to do as long as you have that kind of normal distribution that we were talking about based on Vincent's comment. As long as you have your normal distribution, increasing the grade is not hard. But if you design an exam and it turns out that your students are done in half the time and your grades are all kind of leaning towards the high end of the spectrum, it's really hard to say, oh, I'm actually going to decrease the grade for you, because then students, of course, will revolt. So I would rather err on the side of having too many questions than not enough. And another one from Falafi: how do you deal with first-year students who have never used computer and now they're introduced to this format of assessment? Yeah, okay, so first-year students, just to clarify, and I'm not sure how long it takes you to do that, but how old are these students that they've never used a computer before? I mean, I have a almost three-year-old daughter, and she's pretty proficient on the iPad, even though we don't give her screen time or anything. But you know, whenever we do a FaceTime call with Grandpa in the U.S., because my wife's from there, she knows what buttons to push. So I'm not so sure that first-year students, I mean, how old must they be if they're students? They must be at least 18, right? 17, 18. So they should be able to use computers. But yeah, I mean, if they don't know how, then you can't really do a test that way. Shirley says, should I allow extra time just because it's online? Should a normal assessment that would take 3 hours still get 3 hours or more? So actually, I would make it shorter sooner than I would make it longer. I would try to cover the same learning objectives with fewer questions rather than having more questions and making it go even longer. For the simple issue of toilet breaks. Like I said earlier, I'm not sure if you were here for that, but we've had a big roar from our students who said, well, we cannot do a 3-hour exam without toilet breaks. So during a 3-hour exam, they're allowed 1 toilet break, which means you definitely have to make the exam open book, because otherwise, you know, what are they going to do during that time? Are they going to go to the toilet, or are they going to look up their books? And so I would actually say, you know what, make it shorter, or maybe split it up into shorter exams, such that because for us, for example, the rule is that the first 30 minutes and the last 30 minutes of the exam, you cannot have a toilet break, which by definition then means if you do an hour-long exam, they can't have a toilet break. So instead of having 1 3-hour exam, maybe do 2 1-hour exams with fewer questions, but they still cover the same learning objectives. That would be, I think, a better way to go than to say, you know what, we're going to not do a 3-hour exam, we're going to do a 6-hour exam. I think that would be too difficult. All right. Well, I don't think Falapi is coming back on how old her first-year students are. But again, of course, if your students aren't capable of using computers, then this just doesn't work. You have to give them like writing assignments or something like that, like a paper. Christopher says, how will Proctorio or Iris Invigilation react to a student who abandoned the test for a restroom and later come back? These two systems I'm not familiar with. Proctorio I am, but I'm just going to assume that they all work kind of the same way. If you're using AI to do your tracking for you, then that AI will basically just put a flag there. And I can go back in my slide here. There we go. So basically, this is output from Proctorio, and the abnormalities, it would list them right there. And it gives you some, like, these kinds of, yeah, whatever these things are. And so this 6 just means that when you look back at the video, there's 6 flags. And that's not the theme park 6 flags. But there are going to be 6 little flags, and then as a human, you still have to look at that and say, well, what is this flag? Well, maybe it was just a person looking away for maybe a couple of seconds, or maybe it was during a 5-minute period. He kept looking down as if he was looking at a book, or maybe it's just because the person left altogether for a couple minutes. So again, I think that the other systems like Proctorio and Iris Invigilation do the same thing. The only thing that I have noticed with this kind of software that they really don't like is the VPN thing, where a student's IP address just kind of jumps all over the place. Then they kick you out, because then they say, you know, we have lockdown browser, but somehow you're circumventing that. But if the student keeps it on the same browser, so it's still within the lockdown browser mode, and he just ups and leaves, at least Proctorio doesn't kick you out. It just puts a flag there and says, hey, I see something different. I don't see eyes, right? Because it's kind of looking for your eye movements. I don't see eyes right now, so there must be something going on. So that's basically what will happen. But I think it just, for the other software, I think it just keeps going as well. And Philippi's come back. Yes, they're around 18 years and older. They were not introduced to the computers at their high schools due to lack of resources. Yeah, okay, so great. Then don't do online assessments because in general, I would say if the technology is holding them back to perform, then it's never going to be a good test. The technology cannot be the thing that holds them back to perform. So that's also why for my students who are very proficient with computers, I even do a little test exam in the same exact setup, in the same exact program that we're using for it, which is serious in our country, with Proctorio and everything, just to make sure that they are familiar and used to the software, such that the week after, when they're taking the actual exam, they don't get stuck on technical issues. Some of my students might not even join that test exam because they're like, fine, whatever. Then it's up to them. But most students will join that, and there will be some things that might go wrong. I have actually a lot of students who have work computers, and the work computers, the computers from their offices, they might have firewalls that don't allow for things like Lockdown Browser, or they don't allow for the add-on Proctorio or whatever. That could be a problem. And then we've actually said, well, it's your responsibility to find a computer that works, and that could be your wife's, your husband's, your son's, your cousin's. We don't care, but that's your responsibility. That's again something that we can do in the Netherlands because there are so many computers around everywhere that's easy to do. That's of course not something that can easily be done in other countries where there's not such a proliferation of computers. In that case, if the technology is the thing that's holding them back from performing, I would consider the alternative exams such as take-home exams, writing exams, paper exams, essay exams, and then you simply cannot do the online assessments. Alrighty, so now it's a couple minutes after 4. Afsana, if you have some more questions for me, then pop them right in, or otherwise just take over and let me shut up.
So I think we have quite a few questions in, but I think we've run over by quite a few minutes. Are you happy for these to be forwarded on to you after, and we can get back to individuals after the webinar?
If you have a couple now, just pop them in. I think this is faster than me writing them all out.
No worries.
But if you want to just do it later, that's fine with me too. I just happen to be in another meeting in about 25 minutes. But any questions that I can answer right now for the 88, 87 remaining attendees, or any comments, there might be some great comments that I would like to see. By the way, thank you for taking over the moderating role of the chat here, because otherwise I think it would have been very busy in the chat. All right, so here we get some more. Having a pointer in the presentation to point to a certain element of a slide is very handy. What's the tool to do it? Oh, well, that's easy enough. When you are presenting, you can always just go and say that you want to have a pointer, or you can have a pen, and I can even draw stuff. That's just in PowerPoint. There's no tool. That's just PowerPoint, so that's easy. And Danny says, need to go, perfect. And Ahmed says, I might email you late, that's fine. Of course, you're welcome to do that as well. So Afsana, anything else? She's desperately looking through all the comments that you gave her on the chat, I think. All right, let me erase that now. There we go.
I can't see any more in the chat box. I'm not sure in the Q&A. Let me just have a look. Oh, I've got one here. So can informal activities as part of a WhatsApp group discussion be used as part of formal summative assessment?
Yeah, that's also a very good idea, is to make things that are not necessarily like a traditional kind of test, make that part of their, let's say, grade, right? That's something that definitely in the US is done basically for any kind of course, where at least 10% and sometimes as much as 20% is based on class participation. And I know this has been used in other countries as well. I do it for some of my classes where basically any kind of activity they do online or through WhatsApp or through Facebook or through whatever, we consider that class participation. And it gets a little bit tricky to grade because how do you weigh let's say a LinkedIn post that has been watched and responded to and liked for maybe by 200 people? How do you compare that to a WhatsApp picture that maybe got 50 likes? But anyway, any kind of participation that way could be used for grading. The main thing that I would say, though, is that if you already have your syllabus, your course headline, or whatever it is, that has the graded elements in it, and class participation is not one of those, you can't really just put that in now. I mean, at least not in the Netherlands, because we have to, our course outline is binding in that sense, is that we have maybe 2 or 3 different graded elements, and you can't just replace a whole graded element by something completely different. But it is something that I see moving forward happening more often, because now that we're all forced to do these things online and in a different way, we are all, myself included, considering changing our teaching moving forward, and maybe making those changes in the longer term. You can't really do it mid-course, but if you can do it for new courses, I think that would be a great thing to do. And Kay says, what is the most number of students you have run an exam with the Proctor tool? Oh, that I know of at our university, I think it was about 150. I don't think there's necessarily a limit on it, because this Proctorio or Proctor or anything like that, if you use the non-person version, so there's no person involved, and it's just AI, it's just basically them recording stuff, and it just depends on how many proctors you can assign to go through the flagged instances, because you want to do that fairly quickly, of course. But I don't think there's really a limit to this, Kay. And then finally, I guess, what do you think about marking process and rubrics? Oh, no, we did that already. We did that already, Asana. Yeah, that one we already covered. All right, so it being a little bit after 4 now, I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we'll just go back to the normal setup here. There you go. And Asana, I'll give it back to you for like the final words to close the session.
Perfect. Thank you. That was great. We've had a few more questions, but we will get back to those. I think we're running over quite a bit now. But yeah, thank you for everyone joining on the webinar. Do stay connected. And as Bo mentioned, we do have another webinar tomorrow, which I will actually drop the link for registering in the chat box right now. So if you're interested, do come along, and Caroline will be hosting that. And yeah, do stay connected on social media as well. We're on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you have any questions, do drop us a line. My email address is there, and Bo shared his as well. But yeah, thank you for joining, and yeah, have a good day.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.